Are we live?
Go, Dave.
A very good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Benary Lecture Series, The Immigrants and Their Art, which is part of the Benary Research Centre for the study of the Jewish and immigrant contribution to British visual culture since 1900. Tonight is a very special event and an evening. We're absolutely delighted and frankly honoured to have Anthony Rudolf with us this evening. Anthony is a distinguished poet, novelist, and critic, author, and all things to do with the pen. And of course, was the partner and model of the late, great Paula Rego for a quarter of a century. Paula, unfortunately, recently passed away, and this is, I think, your first live interview, Anthony. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. Just some house rules, everybody. Anthony and I are going to chat. Probably, my guess is on the basis of past experiences, we could probably chat for a lot longer than we're going to chat this evening, but certainly for near enough an hour. And I'm sure there'll be many questions. Please put them in the chat line, and then if we can, I'll either represent them at the end, or in fact ask somebody to represent them personally. So that's the only house rules. If you don't want to be filmed, please turn your camera off. Please maintain mute. And let's crack on. Anthony, welcome to Benary. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you, David.
It's a pleasure. Anthony, we discussed before when we started to plan this wonderful evening, and I asked you whether you wanted to know in advance what I was going to ask you, and you said no. So that contract still stands.
Yeah, it's too late to turn back the clock. If you'd given me the questions in advance, I would have worried about them and gone nuts. So I'm going back. Now I don't know about them. I'm going nuts in a different way. We'll have to see what happens.
See what happens. Well, I think the objective, as far as we're concerned about this evening, is to know, frankly, to know about you, to know about Paula, and to know about your relationship as companions for a quarter of a century. And this is not designed, if we were going to go through the academic route, my colleague Sarah McDougall would be sitting in this chair, and she certainly would interrogate all the different series that Paula did and that you were involved in. But I think this exercise is really more about the human aspects. It's to learn the things that we never ask. Like, what is it like to be a model? How long do you sit for? Etc. So let me start off at the beginning. So Anthony, tell us all a little bit about yourself, first of all.
Well, I was 80 recently, and I've spent my whole life not only in London, but in northwest London, apart from 3 years at Cambridge, 6 months in Chicago and 6 months in Paris when I was very young. Otherwise, I spent my whole life in different postcodes in northwest London. And from an early age, I had various day jobs that were no interest to me. They subsidized my parallel life as a writer, translator, editor, and publisher. And I continued, and husband, shortly at some point to be an ex-husband, but husband and father, and raising a family. And this continued until 1995, which I won't go into anything because we just haven't got time. In 1995, I met Paula, but we didn't, as they say, quote unquote, get together until 1996. I met her through the Anglo-Portuguese, what I could pompously call the Anglo-Portuguese subculture. London, being the great city it is, does have subcultures. The Portuguese subculture was based on King's College, London, Bush House, where I had been working for some time, and of course the embassy, and Oxbridge, the departments of Portuguese, but it was King's College and Bush House. And there was a whole circle of people, translators, editors, broadcasters, immigrants. We can come to that, of course. That's partly why we're here. Sorry, the phone. I'd switch that off.
Well, it's a good opportunity for me to come in, because I have a plan, and of course it will vary and we'll go off in some tangents, but I want to try to do this in some sort of logical order. So
have we reached square one now? In 1996, I met Paula.
Yeah, but not yet, because I want the audience, I want our guests to actually find out about you and to understand you and your career a little bit, first of all. So you've got a wide range of achievements in the literary field. Tell us a little bit about them, and which parts of it actually are the real motivating factors for you, which parts just pay the rent.
Yeah, well, yes, and it wasn't just that in 1996 I met Paula, but I went freelance. We'll come on to that, because that was connected with being her model, and my being master of my own time. But until that point, I suppose my life's work has somehow, it's been a juggling act, because I was not the kind of, I wasn't totally focused on one thing, unlike Paula, who is the great role model there. I was not centered on one thing like writing or editing or translating or publishing.
Which out of these four, Anthony, are in order of priority of your greatest loves? Your poet, writing poetry, editing, critic, publishing. Which
I can't put them. I don't think there's a hierarchy. It's
right.
Somehow what mattered to me was to try to make some kind of impact on the culture, on the subcultures that I belonged to, which was the Jewish, the English, the European, the British. Put them in the correct order you like. I was a humble toiler trying to make an impact in my own way, and I wasn't. I liked the meeting people, and above all, I like being a go-between. You've brought me to the key. I think if anything mattered to me, it was to be a go-between. Now, being a go-between involves, in a way, well, trying to bring people together. For example, a translator and a text, or and through anthologies, bringing people together. I'm struggling with your question, because I'm more focused on and more interested in talking about Paula than about myself.
Which is why I'm asking, because you never talk about yourself, and I want to understand.
And what there was in the late 60s. This is important. There was a great flowering of small presses, poetry presses, and publishers and magazines such as Modern Poetry and Translation, and I was caught up in this very, very exciting world. And I'm one of two last living survivors, two survivors of the first Poetry International, where I participated as a translator of a visiting French poet. And that's another a key part of my life has been French culture and French literature. And and that was in 1969 or 70. But there was a great flowering. I'm not quite sure why, but it was the next great flowering was when everything went digital and you had all that stuff. But I was just the right age. It was just the right moment, to meet people and to make your mark. however small, however, I'm still struggling, David.
No, but I think what we're getting here is interesting, because you spent the last quarter of your life with somebody who dedicated every second of her living being to actually making that difference, making her mark in her way. And yet, as far back as the 60s, you were actually also intent on making your mark. So there is a meeting of minds.
Yes, but my making of my mark was lots of small marks, not one major focus. Of course, it's partly, there is a difference between, I think, the literary or the verbal mind and a painter has to focus in time and psyche, and has to focus and work. Can't do 3 or 4. You can draft a poem, you can edit an article on a train.
You're answering a question that I was going to ask. It's wonderful. Carry on, please.
Yeah, you don't have to be, for a painter like Paula, and of course famously Lucian Freud and so on. And of course painters have a studio which can be mythologized. People, there's so much written about the mystique and the magic of a painter's studio. And it's because where they are body and soul, and it's a very physical activity. Writing is not, some writers might disagree with me, but I don't think it's a physical activity in that sense. You can pick up a pen and scribble a line in a train, as I said.
Can I ask you, I'm jumping a little bit off a tangent into my later questions, but can I ask you, how would Paula answer that question? How would Paula have answered that question in terms of the difference of expression and impact between the writer and the painter?
She would just say, no, just do the work, just get down to it, focus, do it. She would make me work sometimes. I was asked to write something about a painter you may know and everyone will know of or know, Kitai.
Of course.
She and Kitai admired each other and liked each other and had quite a lot in common. And I was very honored to be asked to write a catalogue for him. And I said, I can't do this. This was in the studio after I'd been sitting for her one day. And she gave me a glass of champagne and said, right, start writing. just start writing. So I said, I saluted and I kind of wrote a few lines and read it out to her and said, you just do it. And I just went and did it. And I learned, and I have become more focused than I used to be. This is partly a question of anno domini, of age. One has to, and the key word here is priorities. What are my priorities at 80? When I was young, I thought I could juggle more. I think the question of being the age I am is not that I work less hard or less well. I can do both those, but what I can't do is juggle as I used to be able to. So I was juggling. I was doing a lot of juggling of all the different things I was interested in. And although you could say that Paula was juggling in that she did prints and paintings and drawings and so on, essentially she wasn't juggling in that sense. She was focused on the task in hand, and I would move from one to the other. That's a major difference of mentality. It's neither good nor bad, but it's different. And the verbal and the visual, you'd be surprised, or perhaps you wouldn't be surprised, of the number of couples where one is a painter and one is a writer.
No, I'm not surprised. That's one of the reasons why I was inquiring as to your view.
It's very common, and I think they complement each other.
Yes, exactly. Sure.
And I could in my own way be useful to Paula, not just as a model, but as help her with, for example, how to describe the story she's just painted.
Sure. Let's just stop there, because I want to now go back, if I may, into the mid-1990s when Anthony Rudolf first met Paula Rego, and how that relationship developed, please.
Well, we met. What happened was I met her once or twice, and to be to just make, I had a marriage which sadly broke down after 10 years, and then I had a major relationship with someone else, and that broke down, and then so I was kind of wondering what about that side of my life, and one day I thought about Paula, or Paula strictly, but let's say Paula. I thought, I like her. I'll be proactive. So I made contact with her, and we had a date in a gallery, and we saw. I took her to an exhibition. It was a bit of a risk in a way, a bit innocent of me to say, "Would you like to come to a gallery to see the work of a painter who?" She said, "Who's the painter? What's the gallery?" And I said, "The painter." And this, some of you and some of the people listening to this may remember him, Fermin Rocker.
Of course, yes, we have some wonderful works in the collection. Yeah,
he was a very dear and close friend of mine. And I said, "Look, he's in his 90s. Probably, I'm going anyway. If you come to the gallery, we'll meet." And she said, "I'd think about it." But she did turn up, which was nice of her. And she was wonderful with Fermin. I learned she sort of looked at the pictures, paid particular attention to one picture, and knelt. He was seated there, remember, in his 90s, and she knelt down beside him and talked to him so sweetly and so interestingly about his picture, and he was so pleased. And it meant such a lot to him that Paula, whom he knew about, should pay attention. And then we went and had a drink. Symbolically, it was very important because we went to the Spaniards in Hampstead, and which is where Keats had a drink and may have written what later became or was Paula's favorite poem, Ode to a Nightingale, a poem I read at her funeral, but I'm jumping ahead, sadly. So we went, but that was purely for geographical reasons of where she lives and I live. And so we come to a point I want to make so emphatically that I wonder why I do, which is that I think it's to do with a stereotype, trying to the opposite of a stereotype. We became a couple, or we became partners, became companions. Paula didn't like the word partner because it always reminded her of business partners. But anyway, we became a couple before I became her model. That's important for me. It may not matter to anybody else, but it matters to me because there's a kind of cliche, an art world cliche, about the model who then has an affair with the painter.
Yes, of course, it's usually the other way around.
That's banal and common enough. But in our case, and I think it was actually significant, we sort of settled down and got to know each other before I became a model. And then one day, because I'm a slow learner, it took about 3 months, I said to her, "You know, the only way to see you in your studio in office hours is to be your model, to be a model. Would you consider having me as a model?" And she kind of practically exploded with delight and said, "I didn't dare ask you. I said, I'll be available at any time you like, and I will." She said, "But what about your work? I didn't ask you because you're a busy man." And I said, "Well, look, that's my responsibility to organize my time in such a way that I can be your model. I didn't yet know what it involved, and the rhythm. We can come to the rhythms of that, and the details are quite interesting. In fact, that's the unique part of the story, is the experience of the model. The rest is like going to movies, having dinner, you know, and there's nothing unusual. The unusual bit is being the model. So she said, if you become my model, at last I'll have a male model available. And she said this in a public interview that's on, I think it's online somewhere. It changed things. I think it changed things. Without the availability of a male model meant she could do a certain kind of sequence of pictures which had a male hero. Previously, she'd mainly drawn women, and of course she's famous for her stories about women, and she has had a studio assistant and a model who may be the most painted model in art history, Leela, who is in so many pictures, in so many guises. And in parenthesis, Leela is important because Leela looks like a younger version of Paula. And it means that, in a way, Paula had access to the kind of painting herself without doing self-portraits. But she could bring herself into the picture visually by painting Leela. So I became Paula's model in late, let's be precise, principal male model. That's, I think, the most useful, most accurate way of describing it. Occasionally she would have professional models. Later, as I grew older and the stories required a younger person, I did get jealous sometimes. She would have younger models, but there would be room for a kind of older figure quite often. I wasn't dropped from and I wanted so much to remain part of the story.
And she would want you to be part of that story.
Yes, exactly. But I had to understand. I had to be grown up and understand that some stories needed younger.
And
she had access to certain friends of her grandchildren and one or two other. She got used to the idea of non-professional male models became available.
Sure. Anthony, help us to understand, actually, first of all, how Paula constructed her paintings, because I mean, we talk about models, but Paula's paintings, they're stories. I mean, she had this amazing ability to communicate on canvas, on paper, on print, whatever. But they were stories, and important stories at that. But
she's a story.
Could you describe her almost as a sort of not just the artist, but the sort of the director of the theater of her art?
Well, actually, yeah. I mean, indeed. There are a number of metaphors. She's the conductor of the orchestra. So maybe the models and later the mannequins, that became so important for her to have non-human models. Mannequins that she and one or two other people made themselves. They were not designed to be works of art in their own right, although they have been shown. They were rough and ready to copy. And copying, you know, I've tried to think about this, the whole question of copying and the way a painting works. A painting is, even a figurative painting, is an extraordinarily complex abstract design. I mean, the way Paula put the picture together and the way the different elements in the picture relate to each other. The story is the story is the pose.
Yes.
The pose is the story, and the picture is finished when there's there are two drives. There's a narratological drive, a story drive, and a pictorial drive, a design drive. This is my amateur language. I'm not a professional art historian or art writer, but I could see and understand how the two drives clashed sometimes, and the struggle was to Paula has the idea for the story, but she's not a writer. The story is not something that takes place over time. In that sense, literature is like music, of course. It's over time. The painting is getting time into space, and you to construct the space is an extraordinarily complex intellectual,
Yes,
emotional, and visual. It's very hard work. Paula used for me. I didn't see her pick up a brush for about 20 years. When I arrived on the scene, she started doing her pastel painting.
mm-hmm.
Incidentally, that was one of the things she had in common with Kitai. I think they're the two most important pastel painters of modern times, and they both would refer back to the genius of Degas, a painter of such importance for both of them, and how Degas reached London via Sickert and people teaching at the Slade. It's quite interesting to trace that line, but that's not for now. So she's painting, the paper is on aluminium to strengthen it. Pastels play to her graphic strengths. It's true of Kitai as well. Paula's great strength, that's why she's such a good printmaker, is graphic, and she works away, and she's impatient and didn't want to wait for the paint to dry. So she can work and rework, and it's hard physical work, getting the story right. What does it mean to say getting the story right? It means getting the elements in the picture, the props and the model or models, and the tonalities, the color, everything, getting it all to work. And it's of course instinctive, because she moves fast, and you know how it's not intellectually worked in the way that writers work. And you know, if you've ever seen that film of Picasso, which when slowed down, you see them, he does hundreds of brush strokes.
Yes, yes.
You know, the Paula's, and then sometimes it goes wrong, and not badly wrong. And she would say, "Tell me, I can't." She would in the early days, perhaps even early years, I would be nervous about expressing an opinion if I thought something was going wrong. But she said something's wrong. There came a point where she said something's wrong with this picture, and I said, "Yes, top left." I looked at it, so I'd sort of, perhaps not as stupid as I look, or and more importantly, it's looking, not looking. I wasn't looking stupidly. I was looking. I was learning to look, and I said, "I don't think the top left works."
Just let me ask you one question, but to interrupt you, forgive me. Only just to understand the timing. Roughly how far into the relationship? I want to understand whether this was instinctive or whether this was through your experience.
I don't think I think it was probably a couple of years.
Okay.
Before I really dared sort of learn to have an opinion. And she was delighted, and she said, she looked at it and she said, "You're right, but I can fix that quite easily." And she would probably have found it herself. But then so that gave me courage to have opinions about, and I might get it wrong. I might say, I don't like that very much. And why? I would sort of try and explain. She said, "Well, you're wrong." So that's fine. That she didn't mind at all. She liked and enjoyed the.
But that would add another layer, to the relationship.
And what's more, she's a voracious reader of poetry and fiction. And when I started writing short stories, I haven't really written a novel. That was you misspoke. But I have written fiction and stories, and inspired really by Paula's spirit. And she read them, and she would express strong opinions about the ones about usually I would be overcautious. If anything, the problem was that I was not over daring, but I would be overcautious because I'm an uptight North European, and because she's a completely uninhibited South European, and that's kind of an important aspect of South Europe. There is a difference in mentality, which could be, there's Protestant and Jewish North Europe, and there's Catholic South Europe, and there's another. And her taste in painting, our tastes in painting were different. Our attitude to quite a lot of things were different, but not overlapped enough. They weren't radically different politically. There was important overlap. I suppose with anybody, if you're totally in disagreement, it doesn't work. If you're totally in agreement, that's pretty dull. There's overlap, enough common ground, and yet differences. That's
the ingredients of a great relationship.
That's the ingredient, and there was enough difference with the visual and the verbal, and other. And she was, you see, among the sources of her work. We can come on to that. You may be going to ask me about her sources, and her. She was interested in all folklores. One of her major sources was Portuguese folklore, but she studied, and she had a scholarship from the Gulbenkian when she was young, and they were the best kind of not patriotic. What's the word I'm looking for? Patron.
Mm-hmm.
Best kind of helping artists who need. And she got a scholarship to study at the British Museum in those days. And she made a deep study of Portuguese folklore, but she also studied other folklores. And I brought her to Jewish folklore and Dybbuk, among other things, because I knew she would love that.
Yes.
And other aspects. And she knew in her circle in London, she knew other Jewish people, writers and painters, and as well as her regular circle of anyway. So
can I interrupt, if I may?
Yes, please do.
No. As ever, we could talk for hours, but we don't have hours. Can you tell us a little bit about the actual function of a model in terms of what it's actually like? Because it's very difficult for the viewer to actually look at a painting and actually translate the fact that somebody could have sat there. I mean, Auerbach, you can be talking about once a week for 3 years, or if it's a standard model for longer. So tell us a little bit about the model, because she had you in many different guises and many different shapes.
Many different guises. I haven't done a complete sort of roundup of all the characters I've been in, published in series that have been seen and some that haven't been seen. Paula derives energy from the model. It's one reason why it's tiring work. She's the kind of painter who must have a model, really. Her closest friend, a wonderful Scottish, really, Natalie Dower,
right,
was a painter, influenced more by Russian constructivism.
Right,
works on her own. They're opposite as painters, who works on her own, does her beautiful, beautiful paintings. Paula needs the interaction with the model, the human interaction, and she's not the only one after all. Look, Albach, as you say, with his roster, 6 or 7 key people who regularly,
all the time,
and Freud in his own rather different way. and so on. So the model, and in Paula's case, using non-human models, which was because they could reach the parts others couldn't reach.
Sure.
There were poses I could do with a mannequin that would be unthinkable with a human model.
Yeah. Just draw back just a second. The interaction between the model and the artist is really a fascinating subject. And very often it's the artist that actually does the talking, because the model actually has to stay still.
Well, the artist,
is that the situation?
I learned a few tricks as the time went by. I learned that she's looking, depending on the angle of the picture, of course, but I couldn't, sometimes I could see the picture and sometimes I couldn't. But when she's working, she's looking at me for, say, 10 or 12 seconds, and then is doing the drawing, painting the drawing for half a minute or a minute. So she's looking back and forth, and she'll sometimes say something. And at first I was completely stumm. I didn't say anything. But then I learned the rhythms. And of course, I was a privileged model with the responsibilities and the pleasure that brings in my circumstances, with being so close to her when we weren't working. But when we're working, it's totally professional, and I have to keep as still as I can. And I learned how to not move in difficult poses. It's completely unnatural to keep still in order to get the story that she wants, the person in a particular pose, looking natural.
Yes,
because they don't always look natural, but they can look natural, and sometimes it's kind of artificial. And of course, the totality of the picture with all its elements is a very, very complex artifice.
Absolutely. And the genius of Paula, one of the geniuses of Paula was that she had this miraculous ability in very complex compositions to capture that fraction of a second that she wanted to tell her story, because that's all the fixed dimensions can do. You're looking at it for a second, and then it's got to tell all its story. And that's about the composition and setting everybody in it in the particular way that she wants them to.
I don't know how she did it. There's a story when she was I mean, I see her do it, and she can be filmed doing it. But how it ends up as the finished picture. I mean, Lowry, she had a tuition, one session with L.S. Lowry at the Slade, and he looked at the picture, he said, "I can't do that," admiringly, and then he said he'd buy one, but he didn't. I forgot or something. And then
did she buy one of his?
No, but there is an interesting story about later. I can tell you about Lowry, if you remind me, a very interesting story about the connection after he died. Then another great famous painter, Victor Passmore, went from being a figurative painter to being an abstract painter.
Sure.
The opposite direction from Guston and Arica, as you know, who abandoned abstraction, whereas Passmore went in the other direction. And he took one look at her work. He said, "That's a load of rubbish." But she just ignored him, of course. That was one of her Slade stories about Passmore.
Let me ask you another question, because we're running short of time, and there's so much I want everybody to find out. I want to find out, not just everybody else.
Yeah, shut me up if I'm rabbiting on.
No, you're fantastic. But so let's do some sort of short, sharp questions and answers. Would you describe Paula as a fast artist? Was she invigorated, and she was fast, if you like, whilst other artists are slow?
That's a very good question, because she was both fast and slow. If you look at how she did hundreds of pictures and drawings and prints and sketches, she was, although at any given moment it was slow, grinding work. The picture of me as the cockroach Metamorphosis, Kafka's Metamorphosis, which is a very grand. There are two grand versions of this picture, and I'm quite decorously nude, which is quite unusual, a male nude by a female painter. Alice Neal, who's on show in London at the moment, also had one or two male nudes. The perspective, there's floorboards throughout it, because the picture is as imagined. You have to imagine the cockroach's parents looking through the keyhole, which is how Kafka writes the story, and what they see, the horror of their son who has become a cockroach. And it was murder and slow work for her to get the floorboards right and get the perspective right. So it is a paradox, but she was simultaneously a very slow and careful painter, and also immensely fast. I think it's you can't say she was one or the other.
Okay.
I mean, you might say that. I don't know. No, it's look at the. Yeah, sorry. Does that answer the question?
It doesn't answer the question. It creates all sorts of other questions, but it's one for us to think about and consider this combination of speed and really meticulous care.
I'll give you the speed. She could do something. There's a lovely anecdote. Paula was made an honorary. She got an honorary degree at Cambridge, but she also got an honorary fellowship at Murray Edwards College, which I recommend people. They have the best collection of women's art unless you disapprove. One disapproves of the concept of women's art, which some people do, just as some women poets don't want to be in anthologies of only of women. So,
and, as you know, Ben, nearly a quarter of the Benary artists in our wonderful collection are women.
Well, that is wonderful. Anyway, this Cambridge College, where when she got the honorary fellowship, she was about to be presented with it, with what the document. She said, "Stop." She held the proceedings up. I told she's without. She had without, what's the word? Uninhibited.
Mm-hmm.
I joked once, the reason you have so many exhibitions is that you have no inhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so she stopped the proceedings, took out a sketchbook, and made a quick sketch of the person who was presenting her with the. In a few seconds, she did, and we saw the little at a dinner a memorial dinner for her earlier this week. They brought out this book. They brought it, and then she copied it into the book which she signed. In a few seconds, it's a beautiful sketch. So she could do that immensely quickly. If she was sending me a fax in the day, remember those days, she would send
yes
with a message like bring 6 cans of Diet Coke when you come, and there would be a quick sketch to go with the fax.
Okay, tell us about. I'm so conscious of time. There's so much I want to know. Tell us about her studio.
Well, the studio has. There is a very good book called Inside Paula Rego Studio. I think John McEwan, and there may even be film of it. It was magic, and I did write a poem which was published recently about the models coming to life at night and getting up to mischief in this studio, and then being back in the correct position in the morning. It's a very large studio. It used to be a painter's, it was a place which used to stretch and make frames in Camden, between Camden Town and two very, very, very large industrial rooms, enormous and full of props. When King's Cross was cleaned up, we noticed that there were more rats and mice in the studio than there were before. In fact, and the rent-a-kill man came over, and he looked around the studio, rows of dresses, vintage dresses, and other, and he said, "Well," he said, if you're a rodent, this is a 5-star hotel." So that was because they'd been driven north when King's Cross was
Yeah.
modernized and upgraded. So the studio is full of these props, these dollies, as she calls them, mannequins. And she used to have, in the days when she had the strength, she had an industrial, what's the word? A thing that like a tree surgeon would use that you can go up and down. You know what I mean? I've forgotten the name for it. A machine that
Yes.
enabled her to do the top of an enormous. She wanted to do really big pictures, and she couldn't reach them because, and even a tall person taller than her, and she didn't want to carry. She had a rickety kind of scaffolding and a ladder, but they weren't safe, and so she got this machine so she could perched up. There's a photograph of her perched high on this machine and painting the top of the picture. So, and then there would be pictures half finished or completely finished around the walls, waiting to go to the framer or back from the framer.
And she was very involved, was she not? I remember reading that she was very involved in terms of about the framing.
Ah, somebody's just put up cherry picker. That's the word.
Right.
Somebody's put up on the chat. Paula
Thank you, Julia.
Paula hired a cherry picker. And sorry, she was very involved.
Was she? I seem to remember that she was actually very interested and engaged with the actual framing of the painting.
Well, well, she had, in the end, she got a very good framer, very expensive business, good framing. But, you know, with pastels, you have to be so careful. Well, of course, she used fixative. There was a new fixative on the market, and she was very grateful for that. So you can't have, you must have a glass, you must have you can't risk a pastel which can get rubbed and smudged. So she would have an interest in the technology of framing and the techniques of framing and so on. And of course, more important than that, which you may or may not be getting hovering around, is her work as a printmaker, as an etcher and lithographer. She worked for years with someone who was independently a friend of mine, Paul Coldwell, and his wife Charlotte Hose, both artists. Charlotte is a painter and ceramicist, and Paul is a sculptor and printmaker, and using digital now. And he was Paula's etcher for years and years, and he did wonderful work with her. And she was brilliant at the drawing and working with him on it. And she worked lithography with and the technologies with Stanley Jones, who was a bit older than her at the Slade, a master lithographer, and Paul a master etcher. And as we mentioned earlier, Paula's great strength really was graphic, and that's why she took to printmaking. So
can I ask you a different question?
Yeah,
I'm fascinated by her insightful use of props.
yes,
and outfits. And I don't know, I mean, I've been hovering around the art world as a collector and in the museum world for the last 20 years, and never really gave much thought to the whole concept of how artists not just compose their paintings, but in terms of the props and outfits. First of all, how many artists actually ask their models to wear outfits so that it becomes a real representation? I mean, do you have a feel for that?
I don't quite understand. I don't quite understand your question.
I'm saying, Paula models, you would wear.
Oh yeah, I dressed up. She had vintage, wonderful vintage Piero costume.
Yes, and I'm wondering how common is that in terms with artists. I mean, I'm not an artist, and I've never asked the question. One of these obvious things I've never asked the question. My guess is,
I'm not an expert either, but my guess is it's unusual. But there is evidence I've seen online and I've been told about. Some younger artists have followed Paula in that respect and used mannequins and non-human models, as well as dressing up. You're talking about the human models here. Of course, dressing up. Remember, she's not doing portraits. She's telling a story. And one of my favorite stories that she did was Jane Eyre, and you're looking at Mr. Rochester. And that was she dressed me up. She loved dressing me up, and we went and got costumes from Gostrop, which used to be near her studio. I think they moved to, doesn't matter, they moved. And I got measured up. I wore one outfit had previously been worn by Corinne Redgrave in some TV series. So those uniforms, it was a military uniform. They could tell a tale or two if they could speak, just as the mannequins certainly could tell a tale or two. And indeed the models, as I am now, can tell a tale or two. So you're dressed up for a story as a singer would be in an opera. Coming back to your question of sort of the metaphor earlier of she's the director of, she's the conductor, she's the director, and the studio is a bit like really backstage. When there's no one, when she's not working, it's really backstage of what the props room probably looks like at Covent Garden or the National Theatre. So the fun bit, this is important. I mean, sitting can be quite dull and difficult and tiring. And at the end of the day, a session might, the real fun part was playing around to get the pose right. In other words, Paula has a concept of the story, which might come from her head, or might come from folklore, or might come from Jane Eyre, and she has the available models. And so when it's time to start a new series, you play around, you have fun, you fool around, try out different poses, and then somehow she knows, and it is of course instinct, she knows that's it, that's the pose, that's the story. Can you hold that pose? And I would hold the pose if I hadn't done my, provided my back was behaved well, which is why I have a straight back in all the poses. Leela, her most important model, can take up any position, and the mannequins, of course, can take up even more complex positions. Sure. Without doing their backs in.
And when you were modeling and through these dull moments, I guess that were you allowed to choose, if you could choose what music you wanted to listen to whilst this, or did she have particular favorites?
Well, the music, if left to her own devices, literally and metaphorically, she would put on, she would listen with if she and Leela were alone, they would listen to opera in the morning and fado in the afternoon, or they had their routines, and there were a handful of operas that Paula listened to all the time, and fado music, the greatest fado singer, Amalia Rodriguez, and so they would listen to French chanson. Now, my taste in music is in classical music is solo piano. I listen a lot to Debussy, Chopin, Beethoven, Schubert, the classic repertoire, and Ravel, but I also love French chanson. But Paula never minded if I asked if I could listen to my music, anything to keep me awake if it was a hot day before she had air conditioning. I had to be kept happy like an animal in the zoo. I had to be kept happy, and with promises of paradise after the session was over. So I was kept happy, okay, and kept very still, and then one day you might come back, and yes, and she would paint chalk marks around my feet and other so she could get back the position from the previous day. But sometimes there might be a shift in the now this is the question, is the shift in the design does it mean a shift in the story? You know, this dialectic between the narratological dimension and the pictorial dimension. And so when the two are reconciled, then the picture is finished. But until the picture is finished, the work involves bringing these two elements together, instinctively, largely, but also, of course, with an educated eye. Paula was an extraordinarily well-educated painter. She often talks in interviews. Interviews with her don't always do justice, because they tend to be, they don't talk enough about the art history side of her formation. She knew a lot about art history and references old masters. And when we traveled, that was one of the best parts of our life, was our annual holiday, a week or 10 days around my birthday in early September. We did this until health meant she couldn't do it anymore. We would go to a European city and look at pictures. Who could want a better guide?
Yes, of course. Well, I'm looking at my notes, and I've got a number of questions, and one of them was vacations.
There were travels to shows. When she would have a show, I would go with, and that was fun. That was interesting, and that was not really work for her. She might have a press conference if it was a big show, like the Reno Sofia retrospective.
Yeah.
But overall, you know, private views abroad were pleasant, and especially if they were of a show which had already been in England, and which you know there wasn't anything in inverted commas to do. But the annual holiday to a different European city each year, although we went back, Venice, Florence, Munich, Zurich, Antwerp, and Basel, and obviously Paris, and various other places, including, we'd have to say, London, in the sense that going to exhibitions, Paula would go to private views of her friends' shows, and if she was interested, out of loyalty and as well as out of interest. But she would always occasionally we would go to a private view of if something interested her. And of course, there were the grand shows at the National Gallery and the Tate, and always this privilege of a formidably educated, visually educated person with a head full of references, of a head full of allusions and references to the old masters. By the way, we did go one wonderful show. There have been quite a lot of Jane Munro, the brilliant curator at the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, put on a show of mannequins in art, and the painters who used mannequins. And sadly, Paula wasn't in the show. It didn't work out. But anyway, so yes, I've lost the thread. Ask me the question.
Well, let me go, because I'm conscious that we're over the hour, and as I said right at the beginning, that we could go on and on and on. So what I'd like to do is ask you some quick fire questions, so give us some very quick answers, and then I'm going to ask you the final question, which I hopefully will bring this wonderful engagement to a close. You and Paula, okay? So I'd like you to answer for Paula as well. Favorite artists? 4 favorite artists. Give us a flavor.
Well, I would say Paula. Well, the three big favorites, and ones she learned from, are fellow Iberians: Velázquez, Goya, and Picasso.
Okay.
Those must be in her top 10. And Caravaggio and the mannerist she loved, completely different from my taste.
Go on, please.
Which is the more measured Poussin, Edward Hopper, and Mondrian. That in that sort of direction. But then, of course, there was the overlap. Obviously, how can one not greatly admire Goya? Picasso, I think she thought, was the greatest painter since Goya, really. But Manet and Degas became important to her. Of course, they both used, especially
Pastel.
Used
Pastel.
Pastel.
Sure.
And great. We both adore. We sort of settled, yeah, Picasso and Manet and Degas. But those are some names. I've got a section. I'm trying to write a book about being Paula's model, and I've got a section on favorite painters and other artists.
Okay, next question. Favorite music?
Well, I answered that partly before. Paula's favorite music was opera, Rigoletto, Verdi, above all Verdi, more than any other composer, Verdi, but also, you know, Bel Canto Bellini, and but later she would like Janacek, and she didn't like Richard Strauss, which I did, and on the lighter side, I like Strauss, Austro-Hungarian music, reflecting partly my ancestry, which she didn't really like very much. The Merry Widow, you know, and so on and so on. But common ground was French chanson.
Okay.
Adored French chanson, and above all, this Fado music. Amalia Rodriguez, whom you can find online. Paula wanted to do a portrait of Amalia, but sadly it didn't work out.
Okay. Authors.
For Paula,
Or writers generally.
well, yeah, fiction. The most important writer would be the Portuguese novelist Essa de Queiroz, who was a kind of Portuguese Zola or Flaubert, sort of in that territory. And he was ferociously anti-clerical, ferociously. And the first series she did with me in was Father Amaro, The Crime of Father Amaro, who is a very unpleasant priest, who's actually a seducer and a murderer, really, essentially. It's a kind of forerunner of her abortion, that those concerns. The baby's killed by him and a complicit nurse. It's horrible, hateful man. And Essa de Queiroz was a fascinating writer, and she read very widely in fiction, of American fiction, Joyce Carol Oates, and Jane, and of course the Brontes. She loved fiction, and she adored poetry. This is so important because it brings us to the later part of the end, the last phase. I mean, I read a lot of fiction. I read quite a lot of fiction, but she was devoted to poetry. She went to an English school in Portugal, a kind of, in my mind's eye, the school was like St. Trinian's, because she often told very strange, funny stories about it. It was an minor English public school for the children of port wine families and cork tree families, who were also always English, and for diplomats' children, bit like the French Institute, only a bit crazier. And she went to that school, and she was taught to learn poetry off by heart. And years later, in the later part of her life, and especially towards the end of her life, poetry became more and more important. And we read poetry all the time, and I would read it to her every night for 1 or 2 hours, sometimes more, every night. And it was the English romantics, Eliot, Keats, and Wordsworth, and and she loved Tennyson and Matthew Arnold and so on and so on. The canon, really, up to some modern poetry, but she was a very great reader.
That must have been a tremendous comfort for her.
Well, I think it was, well, because it was a comfort, because the carers went finally, when it reached the stage where she needed carers, they would phone me up and I would read to her. Either she would choose the poems, or I would say, shall we read X or Y or Z? And always, every night, Ode to a Nightingale, which I read at her funeral. So, and one of the important aspects of Ode to a Nightingale is a very Hampstead poem, written in Hampstead. I mean, it's a universal poem, one of the most beautiful poems in the language. But it was also very local to Hampstead, possibly written in the Spaniards, which is where we came, Paula and I came in, as it were. But certainly, if it wasn't, it was written at what was later known as Keats' house. And he walked around the area, and he lived in Well Walk, close to which she lived, before he moved to Wentworth Place. So that Keats is central to her imagination. She was carried on reading him and being read to. And in a way, poetry became more important than painting. She was drawing me until the last, until near the end of her life. She would do sketches. She couldn't do full-scale pastels anymore, but she could sketch. She did carry on sketching. She carried on as long as she could. A trooper, you might say.
An absolute trooper. Just a passionate artist from start.
Yes, and she started when she was about 2 years old. I mean, she did have a good, the only child of parents who encouraged her. Her mother was, I suppose you'd have to say, an amateur artist, and her father was an Anglophile and literature lover, and had many books, English books in his house. I was very moved when I stayed in her house in Portugal, and his bookshelves, he had this English language books, often in the same edition as from my father's books from when I was a child. So English literature was central to her imagination.
Can I ask 2 more questions, and then we have to wrap it up, but very prematurely, unfortunately. First question: Michael Berg has asked a question on the chat line.
Yes.
In terms of how you felt witnessing yourself on the canvas, in particular in quite difficult compositions.
How I felt? Well, that's an extremely complicated, difficult question. I think when I first saw myself, it was kind of, no, let me rephrase that. Pleasure, really pleasure and pride that I was part of the story, inside story of a great artist, as someone I loved and who loved me. But pleasure and pride in the work of an artist which will outlive us all.
I'm not going to ask my last question, because I think you've summed up the essence and the spirit of this conversation, and the essence and spirit of your loving relationship with each other. An artist who you loved and who loved you, and an artist who will remain a central figure in the canon of British 20th century or 21st century art forever. Anthony, it's been a complete privilege, really an enjoyable privilege, which I can't really describe adequately. I can only thank you for giving of yourself in such a way, and I'm sure if we could all get together and clap at home, it would be worthwhile, because it's been just so revealing and so interesting, and I think we're all the richer for it. So Anthony, thank you so much indeed on behalf of the
Can I just say, I want to thank you. The Ben-Uri has been part of my life ever since I was a child. My father was the honorary treasurer at one time. I'm not sure if you knew that. And so the Ben-Uri and the way it's changed and grown, we haven't even touched on. I guessed that you were there was going to be a line of questioning about immigration, and there wasn't. But
I'll be back and do it again. I mean, the answer is I've got a page here with all my questions and all my leads, and we haven't covered half. But
you were not strict enough. You let me rabbit on.
I don't think any complaints, send them to me. But listening to you and listening to the depth of engagement that you both had for each other was inspiring. It really, in terms of just simple relationship building, it was inspiring. And I hope we'll talk again. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.